teach them. There we are. And you're here to maybe think about a different perspective and perhaps a few provocations about how to get them to the next horizon, hence the name of the talk. So I should say also that it's really meaningful to be able to connect with so many people doing this teaching that I find so valuable, because I've often wanted to meet the teachers of the students that I get and sort of have a context for where they're coming from, and also thank them for giving them the really solid skills that they come to me with, and then I can help them build out. So I'll structure my presentation. Hang on, the chat seems to be obscuring my buttons. There you go. I'll structure the presentation in two parts. So I'll reflect first at the high level about the biggest things that strike me about my incoming freshmen and that I grapple with in terms of their writing. And I'll offer afterwards I'll try to offer some really concrete and actionable steps for each of those loftier points that I think would have a meaningful impact on student writing. And before I do any of that, I think it'd be fitting to contextualize my own journey as a writer and a teacher of writing, just so you know where I'm coming from. So I should say that my own former AP teacher, Kathy McHugh from Chicago's North Shore Country Day School, is here in the audience today. And so I want to publicly express my lasting appreciation to her. Hello, Kathy. She knows it already, but Kathy gave me a piece of advice in my maybe freshman or sophomore year of college or high school, before I was even in her class, that occasioned nothing short of a paradigm shift in me as a writer. So as if there's any reason to doubt what you all do is indispensable. And also, unless they're super fortunate or motivated, I think most people learn everything they're gonna learn about reading and writing from you in high school. And in my case, it wasn't after my senior year when I was in Kathy's class, it wasn't until my PhD and kind of late in the game of that, I should mention, that I ever got meaningful writing guidance or advice ever again. So the way that I think about teaching writing is the result of a cumulative process of picking up bits and pieces of helpful interventions from charitable people along the way, working extensively with all species and truly all species of writers at the Writing Center of the Harvard Extension School when I was a graduate student, and now more recently in my teaching in the Harvard College Writing Program. So in that program, I teach both the standard track, which is mandatory for all incoming freshmen, and also the lower track that's aimed to help underprepared writers catch up with their peers. And when I teach my students, I try to give them the clear conceptual tools that I was missing for so much of my higher education, so that they don't have to poke around in the dark for quite as long as I did. That's also the reason I started Ivy Write and the YouTube channel in particular, because I wanted the pedagogy that I've been lucky enough to be part of at Harvard to be accessible to as many people as could use it. So enough about that. When I talk about my experience teaching writing at Harvard, people are often surprised to hear me bemoan the level of writing of my students, because they assume that Harvard students must come fully formed as being, good at all things. And you probably know better. And it's true that as amazingly talented as they are in their various ways, very few of my writers have much, or students, I should say, have much in the way of sophistication in their writing when they come to me. And very, very, very few are genuinely good writers. I think at best they're competent and somewhat robotic. So that brings me to the first thing that distinguishes the genuinely good writers, the good writers who come to me from the rest. And it's a sense of purpose beyond I have been asked to complete this assignment and being a good student, I am happily obliging you, or maybe just fear of what will happen if they don't. What I mean is my average students tend to be adequate and even maybe very good at close reading, but they have very little sense of why they're doing what they're doing beyond the kind of rote plug and chug that they learn in math class, but just the English edition. They think that if they go through the moves that they've been taught, and do the, the checklist of the things, they'll have written a good essay and earn the A that is their birthright. My truly good writers, however, understand that to write something worth reading means having a genuine question or curiosity, figuring out a satisfactory answer by digging around meticulously in the source or sources, and coming out the other side ready to teach the reader. You all, I'm sure, recognize this as a problem of stakes and motive, which are closely related, but not quite the same thing. And what distinguishes the genuinely good writers that I teach is the ability to convey a clear purpose in their writing and the payoff of that purpose. And this really relates to the second big difference between the sophisticated writers who enter my class and the rest. What most of my students haven't learned until I work with them is how to think of sources less like Goliaths to defeat or occasions to navel gaze, or in another possibility, just convenient yes men to recruit into one's army, and more for what they are, which is artifacts out there in the world that can be turned into tools to think and do things with. And artifacts created by real flesh and blood people who love their dog and sometimes get parking tickets. And so maybe don't deserve all the mudslinging that they tend to receive when I ask students to critically evaluate their argument. I want students to stop thinking about sources like carrion to endlessly pick apart, and more like what they are, which is shoulders to stand on and smart people who've come before them and cleared a lot of the weeds so that they can get to their own insight quicker. When my students aren't mudslinging, they tend to just seek affirmation from other voices. And I want them to understand that knowledge is added to by constructive and engaged disagreement, not by saying you're a complete idiot or good job, I agree with you 100%. I could probably go on, but it's as good a time as any to mention that the third and final big thing that distinguishes the truly well-prepared writers who enter my class is an awareness of the levels and uses of counter-argument. I've noticed that even the students who received the most privileged educations at the very best private schools in the country don't seem to realize when they get to me that it's not enough to have a great thesis with lots of evidence to support it. They have to try to inhabit a skeptical reader's shoes and see the limitations, big and small, of what they're doing. So at best, my students with a debate background might think of counter-argument as this black and white adversarial war stance. Though if I ask them to consider counter-argument in an essay about a literary text, they typically seem genuinely baffled because they don't understand why anyone would quibble with their reading of a fictional character who doesn't exist or matter anyway. And some of them are even in the very bad habit of wholesale ignoring counter evidence. So there's a fly that's decided to attach itself to me. So for example, a draft thesis from the first unit of my class might look something like this. This is an actual example. And this student was defending a not very sympathetic protagonist in a short story. And by the time the student revised her essay, instead, she got to basically the polar opposite position. And she got there because I forced her to stop ignoring counter evidence and consider some counter argument that she'd been just downplaying or wholesale ignoring. And counter argument, as we know, strengthens the argument in proportion to the strength that it brings. It gives tension and structure to our writing. And in the early stages of writing, it's quite simply the thing that helps us figure out what we're even trying to say. So for me, counter argument is a really important lesson that writing is an iterative process, not a set it and forget it. So to sum up what I've said so far, the biggest conceptual leaps that the students I teach have predominantly not yet taken is a sense of genuine purpose and motive in their writing beyond I want to get an a richer sense of what sources are and can do for their thinking, and an awareness that counter argument isn't just for debate teams, it's a habit of mind. I would love to dig into any of this further when I stop talking at you and we start discussing, which I hope to do soon. But it would be pretty unfair of me to just list a bunch of problems and not try to offer anything by way of solutions. So I'm going to briefly try to mention a few concrete, actionable things that I think students can learn or unlearn in some cases to do that will make a pretty immediate difference in their writing and in their thinking about writing. So, right, so here we are. So the question of purpose and motive, I wish my students understood that in college, people won't just keep assigning prompts to them because it's so much fun to do. I wish they understood that they'll have to strike out on their own and be interested in order to be interesting. And as some of you know, if you watched basically any of my videos, the way that I teach thesis is to go from snag to the question to the answer to that question, which is the thesis. And the reason I put so much emphasis on this process in particular is because I really want them to have discovered their own stumbling block in the source and then go through the experience of posing a productive question about it that inspires purpose that's more specific than just, for example, what's the faults in so-and-so's argument. I wish students knew before coming to college that when we give them prompts, it's to cut through the effort of steps 1 and 2 to help them get right to thesis. And that when they have a prompt, unless it's terribly conceived and really mindless, it will embed a worthwhile snag for them. And eventually those guardrails are going to go away. So in terms of actionable steps, hang on, I've discovered the very inconvenient thing that when the chat is live, it blocks my slide buttons. I'm going to reconfigure things. There we go. All is well. Everyone can keep chatting. So, right, in terms of actionable steps, I think students who are ready can learn that, or rather unlearn the habit of using a hook in their introductions and instead think of snags, because in their hands, as you all know, a hook tends to be a cheesy gimmick, whereas a snag stems from a genuine intellectual engagement. So I have a video soon in which I talk about introductions. It'll come out maybe this Friday, I don't remember. But in short, what I advise students to do is to stop thinking about their readers as a fish to be caught and reeled in, but instead as Watson to their Holmes. I tell students to either show or tell us the snag, and the results can vary. So an example from a student's essay of mine this past year of showing, so she wrote, Sally Mann's collection of photographs, immediate families, full of poignant black and white portraits of her family in the American South, and on it goes with the showing. And then also telling, right? So in her book, Racial Innocence, Robin Bernstein defines childhood as such and such. And then she talks about the tension and then the snag and so on. So in keeping with that framing, if students can come to think of their introduction as less of a formulaic going through their paces and more of a breadcrumb trail that lays out for the reader the process of their own, as in the author's discovery, question, and answer, to me, that's a pretty instantaneous level up. Students need to think of writing less like a checklist and more like a logical progression. And I often find that minds string along sentences one after the other for no discernible reason. They just wanted to move on to the next thing, maybe on their mental rubric, and they leave us behind, or they leave me behind anyway, when they do. And I think when they're ready, they can learn the reasoning behind the formulas that they've been applying, which is true of math too, but we're not here to talk about math. And that brings us to the question of what to do with sources. And I'll make 2 suggestions. First is to teach students to incisively settle on a motive for writing before they write, which I like to tell my students is a manageable thing to do, given that humans are smart, but not that smart, and we ultimately bring a finite number of cognitive approaches to any problem that we encounter. So the list that I give them is the one I've included on the handout, which if you like QR codes, there you go. I think Alfonso might also, or someone might drop the URL in the chat as well. So you'll see there the list that I give them. And just for context, I give them a single source version of this list early in our semester. And then by the end, when we get to research papers, I give them the list you'll see on the handout, and I embed within it, I ask them to tell me why it makes sense and how we got there, the single source motives they'd seen before, but now they're sort of in a nesting doll form because there's more complex things going on. And I think that this sort of approach is reductive in exactly the right way, insofar as coming to insights about complex texts can often feel like a process of alchemy or divination. And in some ways it is, but if we have some tools that helps us bring things down to size and leave a little bit less up to the gods, I think we should use them. So my second concrete suggestion for how to help students level up their sophistication when it comes to source use is I preach the gospel of Joseph Bissup's beat method. I've never met him. I should probably send him some fan mail. I really like this method. I've included the citation as well on the handout, and I'm happy to say more about this method in the discussion portion if anyone's unfamiliar with it. But the reason I really like it is that I think it helps me force students stop doing the comfortable thing of using sources as background, in other words, just facts, or also just affirming yes men that we talked about earlier, and actually get them to think about using sources to construct structures of their own where they're responsible for adding to knowledge and information. And that brings me to the third and final high-level problem I mentioned, which is counterargument, and two concrete suggestions for how to help students get better at it. And again, I'd love to talk more about this in the discussion because this will be pretty brief. So I teach counterargument as existing at three levels: implicit, brief but explicit, and extended explicit. And if I see that a student is able to include any counter argument at all, I see that as a win. But if beyond that, they can treat it as less of a checklist item of like the penultimate paragraph, they've got to get it out of the way, their essay is ending, then that starts to be very good news. So by the time I'm done with them, my students might still find counter argument really hard, and I'm okay with that because I think that it is. But they at least know that some arguments are controversial enough to merit an extended initial counter-argument. Others are fine with a brief but explicit counter-argument tucked into a body paragraph. And in either event, you need clear signposting to help the readers know what they're looking at. And of course, for the same reason that writing is not an act of conforming to a rubric, some essays might need a dozen counter-arguments of various shapes and sizes, whereas another might be just fine with a small one. But none of this is especially concrete. So by way of conclusion, I'll offer two possible approaches that you might try with your own students if you haven't already. Again, I'm curious what you all do. And if you teach counter argument, I frankly don't remember if I learned anything about it earlier on. But basically, the first is to build in a step where students are doing an activity after they've come up with a thesis that helps them think about possible objections to their thesis. So in my class, we do a rough draft and a revision for every essay, and the students write a cover letter for each, which is their chance to metacognitively reflect on what it is they've done. And then it sort of starts a conversation between us so that they're not having this instinct of trying to get something by me because they know I smell everything and can pick up on all of the things. And then we just have an honest conversation of, oh, you agree your thesis isn't very good, let's talk about it. So anyway, in that first essay of the first unit, when they're doing a single source assignment, I ask them as the final step of that cover letter to think about a limitation of their argument or an objection. And that's sort of the starting point for us when we think about revision. The other thing I do is to put them in groups where someone's role is to play a skeptical or easily confused reader, and the writer has to explain orally, not read at people, what their argument is. And then the partner's job is to come up with as many clarifying questions, confusions, pushback, etc., as possible. I think it works really well because they get kind of competitive and engaged at generating lots of skepticism. And often they come up with way better counter arguments for each other than I came up for them. So anyway, if anyone's interested in how I structure this, I'm happy to share the handout and just email me here. So that's it. It's hard, again, to choose what to talk about because one can talk for many hours about each one of these things individually. So I'm hoping this is just a way to prompt a conversation. Some things I didn't dig into or even mention at all are conclusions. One can say as much about that as introductions. Signposting, which I mentioned really briefly, but it's something I find students really struggle with and seems to be completely new to them somehow when they get to my class. And then of course, transitions of the real kind, not the checklist, here's my transition sentence, I'm going to throw in a furthermore kind. So maybe we can talk about one of those things or any of those things, and I'm going to stop talking.
All right, thank you very much for all of this. And the questions were kind of, I'll start with a couple of things that folks wanted to hear a little bit more about. Yeah, the in conclusion thing. First, if you could kind of delineate a little bit more what you mean by snag
Sure.
versus
Hook.
hook, right? Which I
Yeah.
think all of us are interested in hearing.
Yeah. So what I mean by a snag is, okay, so we've all had the experience of teaching a source and students just don't understand it. And then we have to help them understand it. But once they've gotten to that level of basic comprehension of what's on the page, I like to encourage students to have the faith in themselves to trust their gut, that even if they're reading, an article by a moral philosopher at Harvard, they're thoughtful enough that once they've done their basic due diligence, they might have a gut feeling that something doesn't add up in the argument, or he talked about this, but he forgot to talk about that. Just some kind of basic intuition that there's more to say here. And so the snag for me is just a way to put it. I think if you've seen the video on snags, I have like a silly example, like literally a sweater getting caught on something and a thread sticks up. So you can't help but notice it because it sticks out to you. And that feeling of there's more to say here, this is the spot I want to dig in, is basically what the idea of the snag is, versus a much more external idea of a hook of how do I reel them in, how do I catch them, which is again kind of a salesman tactic. So
Sorry, the mute thing escapes me. A little bit more about beam, that theory. If you
yeah,
could kind of
let me go.
expound on that.
Yeah, I'll go back
We,
to this slide.
okay, and we do have, someone posted, if you guys didn't see that, there's somebody posted a link to a brief explanation, so you might want to check that out as well. Go ahead, I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, sure. So basically the acronym, and I teach BEAT, and I'll explain why, not BEAM. So the acronym is just meant to get at the fact that sources aren't primary or secondary, in the sense that when we teach this, it tends to solidify this notion that a source just statically is something, and I found the source on the sidewalk and it's a primary source, or I found the source on my bookshelf and it is a secondary source. What BEAT helps us think about, and I use it in my own scholarship because a light bulb went off in my head when I saw this, is that a source is whatever you do with it. So the same article, for example, by a scholar might provide you some background info if there's just context on a world event or something like that. But if you dig into a passage because you're analyzing that scholar's article, then it's suddenly an exhibit source for you because you're quote unquote treating it like a primary source. You're looking at the language, you're looking at the argument, you're analyzing the source as an end in itself. Maybe elsewhere in that same source, there's an argument, and maybe you're going to build on that argument by disagreeing with it slightly, or agreeing with it, but adding something it missed or something like that. And potentially in that same article, there could be just a theory, like a term, for example, that is not something you're going to engage with, like in a duking it out, building on it kind of way. You're just going to use it as you would a hammer, like a tool. And the distinction he makes between theory and method is that in the social sciences or the sciences, there tend to be more methods. I mean, I guess we would say a close reading is a method, so humanities have it too. But I tell my students, like, polymerase chain reaction is a method in science. When scientists do PCR, they're not thinking about how to make PCR better. They've taken it as a given and they're using it to get to their ends. And so too with the theory, if it was new historicism or eco-criticism or whatever, we tend to use it as a tool to do something with. So I love this. I could probably talk about it all day, but it's super hard for them at first. And then when they get it, they really get it and they become very sophisticated very quickly. So.
Excellent. We can kind of continue that. And, you know, for us in the AP world, of course, kind of thinking about synthesis sources, you know, in this context, right? And the kids kind of paying attention to that. I think a couple of people mentioned, you know, kind of a thoughtful approach to synthesis. And as we talk about conversations between and among the sources, are also, you know, those things invite kind of deeper understanding, right, of the arguments that are happening, right? And that's always good to see students do, especially in a kind of a timed situation where they're, and again, that's the expression that what they do in the time situation, right, is that expression of the skills they've learned over the course, presumably of, you know, at least our course. So those are really kind of important things for them to consider. And also, you know, it also speaks to that complexity and nuance, right? And their understanding of the rhetorical situation, right? To see those intricacies in different sources. And of course, they're going to do that. Somebody mentioned, somebody asked a question, and this is for you actually, what kind of textbook you would recommend for those kids who are transitioning from high school to college writing, right? And as we talk about the kind of writing they'll do in college, it's, you know, it's very much about, you know, dealing with sources and dealing in that kind of world of argument between and among those sources in any given discipline, right? So it's, you know, again, and we've talked some in our, you know, kind of circles about transferable skills. And, you know, these are really, really important transferable skills for our students going forward. So a couple of things, and we could, you know, talk about this beat theory quite a bit, but if you would kind of first consider if you have a suggestion maybe about a textbook that you would recommend. It's kind of, you know, it's kind of putting you on the spot. And also, if you would discuss also real quick this cover letter that you use, because that seems to be pretty intriguing. I like that idea too. So go, you know, go ahead.
Yeah, so I'll say I realize there are textbook authors in the audience. So I'll just admit that the thought of a textbook for me is very foreign. I know there are so many good books, and I, you know, find pages and approaches in them that I then adapt to things that I do, but it's sort of the opposite of what we do in our programs. I know nothing about writing textbooks. I'll just be super honest about that. And if it's something I'm looking to learn more about, just because I know there's really good things out there, but everything I do is kind of passed down through generations of mentors and things to me. So I think I've just developed my own textbook informally over the past couple of years. The cover letters are, so in the draft, so I give them a prompt for questions to answer in the draft cover letter and in the revision cover letter. And I remind them that it can't be the same letter because it's not the same essay. Once in a while, I'll get a student who just copies and pastes, like, are we on the same planet? But I ask them questions like, first of all, I ask them to start by restating their thesis. And I say, do not copy and paste, say it anew. And the thinking is they've just gotten to the end of their draft. In the draft phase, they probably just figured out maybe a little bit what they might want to argue. And so in the cover letter, it often tends to be the case that the thesis is the very best because they write it last. So I start with that. Then I ask them to tell me what what they're proud of in the essay, what they think works best. And we have a vocabulary we use, it's just a vocabulary not unfamiliar to any of you, but just things like thesis, stakes, argument, evidence analysis, like these kinds of things. And I ask them to think about what they're proud of in those terms. Then I ask them to think about what needs work. And again, at the draft phase, it's very low stakes because I'm not grading the draft, I never would. It's just an entry point to a conversation. And then I asked them to tell me what they would do if they had an extra day to work. And I'm sure there's something else I'm forgetting, but I like that question because it just acknowledges that we're human. People are doing things at 3 in the morning. And I'd rather, it tells me a lot when they say, I need to fix my commas, but their essay is a train wreck, versus when they say, I don't think my thesis really works. And then I'll be able to say, oh, I agree with you completely. And I'm really glad that you see that. So it's just kind of a, are we on the same planet sort of opportunity. And then in the final draft, again, I tell them, I see everything. You cannot trick me into thinking this is a better essay than it is, but demonstrate that you see its imperfections and I will sleep easier at night. So it's a version of the same kinds of questions. And again, I'm happy to share the actual prompt if anyone wants to email me, but actually I go so far, I believe in these so much that I even give them grades on the cover letters for the revisions later in the semester once they've learned how to talk to me about writing. And I have colleagues who don't really get the cover letter and don't really use it very well, and then they think it's a waste of time because it can be, but I am a full-on believer, and I've never had a bad conference with a student after a draft. They come in with a sense of ownership and what they want to get out of the conversation with me, and we're just already in mid-conversation before we even ever exchange words in person about something. So I realized that very few people have the luxury and time to do that kind of extended drafting process, but any like sliver of this that you could build in, I think gets them out of the mindset of sneaking things by you.
All right. Thank you for that. And so there's lots of interest in that cover letter prompt. So we definitely want to do that. And that's something that we can also put on the Mosaic page, and I'll make a note of that. So if Lucia, if you would send that to me also,
Yeah,
we'll make sure that it goes on there.
Yeah.
Okay. We could probably do that. Yeah, the Facebook page is always the great equalizer, so to speak, in terms of a repository of ideas. And you've been on there as well, so that's really
It's a great
cool.
place.
Okay, so another question we have here, real quick, is if you could talk a little bit more about signposting, which is
I saw that
a really
question.
interesting idea.
It makes me so happy. I'm truly baffled by how little my students understand that we can't be inside their heads with them when they decide to suddenly take a left turn in their argument. So I have to confess that this is something I'm not super, I haven't yet found like the magic way that this works for me in terms of teaching it. But I, for starters, have just a handout on the kinds of signposts we have. And they're things like, moving from fact to interpretation, or like concession, or instrumentalizing something. In other words, whatever. But so signposts like, be that as it may, or nonetheless, or some might argue, just, very common sense things that we use in our writing and see in good writing. And what I do, so I first make students aware of this as a concept, and that tends to blow their minds. And then I, in draft feedback form, I do video feedback. So I do video recordings of their essays and sort of talk through them as a reader, responding to them. And I'll show them, like, I have no idea where this sentence came from. What are you doing in this sentence? Are you agreeing with the source? Are you disagreeing? Are you, like, what's happening? And so I kind of dramatize my confusion, and they realize how little work they've done to help me understand. And then another thing I do is, so we read very well written scholarly. I think someone might want to mute themselves who isn't muted. So I'll unmute myself. So I teach, I try to teach really well-written, engaging scholarly articles that are just beautifully written in addition to being brilliant. And I actually have my students do different kinds of annotation on an app called Perusal, but that was probably a pandemic era relic. I don't know if I'll keep using it. I might, but anyway, so they kind of group annotate things online. And I have them do two kinds of, I see someone else use Perusal too. I think I'm getting fond of it. So they do sort of two kinds of annotation. And one of the kinds of annotation that they do is not about the ideas, but about the way that it's written. And when I have them color code and identify different kinds of signposts in good writing, they start to see how woefully inadequate their own is. And then I actually, when I have time, build in some time after they've drafted for them to color code signposts in their own writing and see either, oh, I use however 20 times and literally nothing else, or I have, no signposts at all, or so on. So that's, I don't know, hopefully, is that a little bit in the way of talking about signposting? Hopefully.
Yeah, I think that informs it a little bit more. A couple of other things, and yeah, signposting sounds, something similar, uh, uh, at least in the conceptual kind of framework to transitions. And again, kind of signaling the reader, right? Where you're going, and somebody mentioned this, where you're going to next, right? Where is that argument going? A couple of other questions, and you guys, this is awesome. You guys are pouring into questions. That's great. I'm trying to keep up as best as I can. So a couple of things about the idea, the time you said you spend with conferences, right? That's always a point of concern, right? I guess for, in terms of time and in terms of the usefulness of a writing conference. So how do you handle that? How do you, in terms of time?
Yeah, so maybe it's more useful. Well, let's see. When I teach the lower level writing class that we have, it might be a little bit more comparable to just the interesting mix of people I'm sure you all teach. So those writers are a little bit less self-empowered. My awesome regular track students are just, jaw-droppingly good. They come in with like detailed 3 single-spaced pages of reactions to my reactions, highlighted questions of things they wanted to follow up on, and it's crazy, and they impress me a lot. And I do almost no work because I have already done the work of responding to them. So then I just sit there as a body in a chair and I say, you're in the driver's seat. What do you want to talk about? What would help you take the next step? I should also mention, so back to the topic of cover letters, I always give them a revision step in their draft feedback. And so that's something that they have to actually do. It's a concrete step, like try writing your thesis again now that you've sort of got closer to it in your cover letter, or you have no counter argument, try to think of one, something like that. And then they come in having done that. So when we have a conversation, there's like something new to talk about. So there's that, but with the weaker writers, it is not as much the case that they can run the show. And so I tend to be very prescriptive. So they still get a revision step, but I would have them fill out like a template of some sort, or try reverse outlining, give me your reverse outline, something like that. Again, I realize it's very resource intensive. I'm always exhausted when I do this, and I have only 30 students a semester. And I'm sure some of you have more. I actually am very curious how many how many students people teach, but the 30 and the three essays and the 3 rounds of things and the 2 for each thing, it's just unreal. Okay, I'm seeing some astonishing numbers. Yeah, so it's obviously not feasible. I moved to video feedback in part as a way to spare myself a little bit of wrist action and just sleep, because we can say much more quickly when we talk and kind of synthesize. So if anyone's interested, I'm happy to talk more about that. But again, I moved to video feedback partly as a survival mechanism, because though I have not that many students were asked to do a lot of hand holding. So it was a way of making it tenable to me. But I suppose if I didn't have the A, professional obligation, and B, luxury of conferencing with each of them individually, I would probably work it into some group setting where they have to really be accountable to what they're doing. Someone takes notes. I actually have a thing I do for that as well. If anyone's interested, you can email me for that template. It's like a group workshop thing. And again, there's a lot of accountability built in, so they usually can't hide, not that they want to.
That's always, yeah, and that's, and you're right, the numbers, the numbers are, and I think that's, where a lot of the questions come from, right? In terms of conferences and things like that. But yeah, video has helped a lot, as a couple people mentioned. Moat helps as well, because you can read their essay, um, as you go along and make comments. So it's somewhat like a conversation, right? And it's somewhat like a writing conference. So
Can I actually ask a question? What
yeah,
is moat?
absolutely.
Is it spelled like the
Sorry.
castle kind of moat?
MOTE, actually.
Oh.
Yeah, and it's a Google extension, and I'm sure
Oh.
it's available in other platforms. It's audio feedback, essentially. You record yourself, and that's what I do. I've done that with a couple of assignments where you just record yourself reading the essay, and okay, and it gives them feedback as you go. So yeah, all these resources that we're going to talk about, or that we have talked about, will be on the Mosaic site. Okay, I'll make sure that we kind of collect those, and make sure that those are all available for y'all. I kind of committed you to share your slideshow, Lisa.
It's fine. I'm happy to.
So we're going to do that. And I think a lot of the stuff you've been mentioning is on the Ivy Wright site also. So, but direct stuff that we can include is going to be awesome. So a couple of more things, and I'll go back to some questions that I want to make sure that we get this. One, of course, the idea of stakes, high stakes, lower stakes, not to deal with, how kids submit, your cover letter, for example, right? So if you could talk a little bit more about how that works for you in the context of, the writing process.
So is the question, at what point do I make them think about stakes, or how do I help them think about stakes? Or
I think it's more like how you think about, in the context of the feedback and the process, how you, there we go. How do you get them thinking about stakes when it is an assignment, right?
yeah.
So that's always,
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. So
yeah, I do get it. So I have to say, my old friend, the Snag, really helps here, because I give them the text, but I don't tell them what they have to write about. And I think I choose pretty okay readings. And, I have the slight luxury that they've in theory opted into my class, but like all of you, they're also forced to be there. And inevitably I'm someone's absolute last choice, and the feeling's mutual. So anyway, but when they get to choose their own snag, like I've had students say, oh, I feel like I should write this about like a gender thing. I'm like, well, you don't seem very excited about that. What do you actually want to write about? And they're like, oh, well, like the mother character is like really abusive or something, or they'll be really interested in some kind of fringe thing, like, well, then do that instead. So they have like time in the response papers leading up to the draft to figure out what they really care about. And I say, you are going to spend 3 weeks of your life thinking about this text, reading it like a bajillion times and writing about it a lot. So why would you do this to yourself? Choose something you care about in it. And I kind of, I leave it at that, because again, I think interesting people are interested people. And so if you can't get excited, maybe you have no pulse generally, like there's something here, I promise you it's a good text. So the stakes in that sense are a little bit baked into the premise, because if they decided to write about it, they must have thought something was worth writing about. So the question for me is more, how do I get them to articulate what it is? And so I have this very weird analogy that I plan to include in a future video that I think must come from my Slavic background, but I think of a nesting doll or an onion, and I try to convey to them that, in the innermost layer, you might articulate why something matters to understanding that character you're writing about, or like, if we're talking not literature, then the specific, I don't know, historical person or whatever. And then a layer out from that might be thinking about what that person's experience says about the time that they lived in. And then a layer out from that might be on what the time that they lived in still says to us today. And I kind of just try to get them to just gradually zoom out. And I know someone had put in the chat a question about conclusions. Amy, I see your comment, you're very kind. The thing with conclusions that I tell them is, don't start in conclusion and then tell me what you've just said. We can read. I have eyes, luckily. I know this is all of 5 pages. I don't have the memory of a fruit fly. Instead, start with sort of where you want the next essay to begin, and end with where you want the next essay to begin. So I kind of say, human knowledge is this chain. A reader reading your essay should want to get to start their own essay as soon as they finish reading yours, because that's how provocative it should be. And so that conclusion is a chance to zoom out again to stakes and think about the author, what they might have been doing or saying with the work, or the time in history, or just something broader, having earned their keep because they've done careful analysis of their evidence in the preceding however many body paragraphs. So I tell them to wax poetic if they've earned it.
That's a really cool way to put that. I like that. I want to get to this. We're kind of getting towards the end here, and somebody asked about you providing PD, by the way, so you might want to kind of jump on that.
I'd love that.
But there was a really pretty interesting question about the writing process itself, and how you would treat the writing process as a thinking exercise versus, you have to employ the writing process. And I find myself telling my kids that all the time, right? They're not using the writing process, you are wrong. But, kind of transferring that to a thinking exercise, how would you kind of, how would you express that?
Yeah. So inevitably every semester, when my student, when pardon my language, shit gets real, and my students realize that I may seem really friendly, but I'm going to make them work extremely hard, they get really scared, and someone says, "This is really hard." And I say, "Welcome to the club. Writing is so hard." And I tell them, I find writing extremely difficult. I do it for months. I work on the same thing for months or years. Welcome to the club. So in terms of writing as process, what I think they start to see
Emily,
really
is your
quickly,
interview 225 to 250?
Sorry about that. Go ahead.
No. So where was it? Yeah. So I think what they realize really quickly is that something like outlining is no longer going to serve them, because when they're thinking deeply about something complicated, then they can't play the chess game out in their mind before it happens. And it really is like a chess game. And so for this reason, I actually teach reverse outlining, because I think I teach them, there's no way you're going to actually figure out the brilliant thing you're going to say ahead of time unless you're a genius. You have to write it, and then you reverse outline to figure out what it is you did, so then you can redo it and make it actually something someone wants to read, because you're not pulling us along, the back of your car. So I don't know how concrete that is, but I think I impress upon them that everyone, at the university level, everyone teaching them, everyone around them is struggling with writing all day and all night, all the time. And so they could just inaugurate themselves into this, club of fellow sufferers, and it's a beautiful thing.
That's awesome. So I think a couple of more things, and we only have a couple of minutes left. And we'll hopefully we can do this if you're willing to share. Somebody asked earlier about kind of maybe sharing a list of texts that you use in your class, kind of as mentor text or things like that, things of that nature. I do, and I totally dropped the ball on this initially. Perfection learning is making most of this possible, because perfection learning provided the team with Zoom accounts. So that was really awesome of them. And I would be remiss not to mention that. And a question about reverse outlining. I think that idea is really pretty important, kind of and time, time to work with the text, that kind of thing. But we'll kind of, as we talked about earlier, folks who are here, and thank you very much, Lusia, for being here. I really I think we all appreciate that. We will put as much material as we can on the Mosaic site for you to access. Please make sure you bookmark Ivy Wright so you can see a lot more of that. And again, we will to honor the time. I know some of you folks probably want to attend the lit session that's immediately following this. It's a different Zoom link, by the way, so you need to kind of secure that. But I do want to thank you again very much for your time. Thank you for being here. We'll, if you can, hang out for a little bit, and we'll.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you, everyone. This was really fun.
Thank you all very much for being here. Appreciate it. Okay.
And the Exodus begins.
Yes. And I think a lot of folks who do this. Whoops. Oops, sorry, I almost ended the whole thing. That would have been disastrous. I am going to stop recording now.